Hi, everybody. Happy Halloween. It's just me. Don't be scared. I just couldn't resist, though. It's kind of scary, kind of creepy. Anyway, I hope you're doing okay and you're getting excited about, well, hopefully doing something for Halloween, at least watching Charlie Brown and his pumpkin. Hopefully, you got something planned. All right, want to hear something else scary? You got an exam next week. So let's go ahead and do some discussion of that. Just take a second to get this silly stuff out of here. All right, there I am. Isn't that better? Yeah, much. Still a little spooky. Okay, so let's do that. Let's share the screen here and let's talk about the exam. So here's the poop. You already know all this stuff. I did get a couple of questions that I thought oops, sorry. Shoot. God. Just give me a second here. Why is this not working? There we go. All right. Whew. So, it is anytime next week between Tuesday, 12 a.m. and Thursday at midnight. It is a single 80-minute session, okay? Except for you that get the extra time, you have to take it in a single session. Once you log off, you're done. So don't log off. Stay on, and you'll be given the full 80 minutes. We just don't want anybody to, stop and then look up answers and, takes time to restudy or something like that. An 80-minute session should be more than enough. I think it's going to be about 50 questions. So it makes sense for you to study hard. Please study hard. Even though it's open book, it's important you study. You will not have a chance to look up every question or even, more than, say, 10 or 15. Study hard, go through the test, 50-question multiple choice test, and mark the ones that you're a little unsure of. And then after you're done, maybe that will take maybe 45, 50 minutes at the most, probably. You'll have time to go back, okay? You'll have, at least a half an hour to go back and look up the ones you're unsure of. And boy, are you going to do well if you do that. And you can use anything you want except each other. So it must be taken alone, and we have ways of checking that. So please don't fudge on that. We had some problems with that in this last spring, but I trust you. You all have very honest-looking faces. It covers everything through today, and I'm going to have to go a little faster today, just so you know that. To get through everything. It also covers the discussion section material that you went through last week, which was on taste. So there will be some taste questions on this exam, but only one or two that are derived from the discussion section material that you had last week. And then all book material through chapter 4, including the preface. And do read through the preface. Maybe take a couple of notes on things that look like they're, content worthy. Don't have to worry about personal anecdotes or anything like that. But there is one question at least that is from the preface. Okay. You can, if you want, you can look through chapter 5 and find the material that was covered in section on taste, if that helps. But there's not going to be any detail from that chapter on this exam. It's just the material right from discussion sections. Good news, your discussion sections Friday and Monday will act as review sessions, and I believe the TAs are all getting together and they're making sure that they run it the same way. I think they're going to ask you some practice questions, maybe play a game, certainly have time to answer your questions, which is important. I've asked them to remind you of this, but you should look through your notes if you can before discussion section. I know that you're not planning on studying. A lot of you probably aren't planning on studying until next week sometime, but if you can look through your notes and see anything that's unclear, tomorrow and Monday during your sections are the best time to ask those questions. Okay, let me take a couple of seconds, and before I answer questions from the chat, I just wanted to mention, if these are questions that I did answer on last class, in the beginning of last class, I don't have time to re-answer these questions. So if they are questions that I have answered, I suggest that you go back to last class's recording and look for those answers, okay? I'm sorry, I just can't re-answer questions. I don't have enough time. But let's see what we got. All right. Oh, Keelani was scared. John is digging my scary thing. My goodness, I look terrifying. Ooh, spooky. Oh, there's no questions from you. All of these are about how wonderful I was. Happy Halloween. Thank you, Amy. You can't hear. No, I think most of you are hearing okay. It's my birthday tomorrow, and Halloween is my favorite. Happy birthday, John. So how are we not allowed to take? How are we not allowed to take the test? Oh, it's open book, but we aren't allowed to leave the test to look at the book. Okay, John, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking here, but happy birthday, first of all, and I hope you enjoy Halloween, your favorite holiday. But you are allowed to look at the book. You are, during the test, you are allowed to look at your notes. You're allowed to even look at pieces of the videotape if you have some time. But the problem is you'll have to do that during the 80-minute period, which is why you need to study. Do you score after you submit the test? Yeah, okay. Thank you for mentioning this. I believe, I think I tried to shut this off, but you might get a raw score after you take the exam. But don't worry about that raw score. There's probably going to be some type of curve. So, you know, if you look at your score and say, oh my gosh, that looks like it's going to be a D or an F, there's going to be some sort of curve. So you know, don't worry until we talk about how letter grades are going to be applied roughly. Letter grades are not applied till the very end, but I'll give you some sense of how you're doing. I try to turn that off so you don't get your number grade until you get a letter grade range, a rough letter grade range. But if I can't figure out how to do that, there you go. Okay, last lecture was posted. I think it's there. Please look. Okay, do you believe in Halloween? I believe that Halloween is fun for a lot of people. Is there participation points in the exam or only points for the correct answer? I'm not sure. Never heard of participation points for an exam. The test is on iLearn, correct? Absolutely. Will there be a study guide? No. The study guide, I would just say you can just use the notes from, you can just derive the study guide right from the PowerPoint slides. That's probably the best thing to do. And then, of course, you know, look at the questions that I've been posting. Those are free. You know, you're going to ace those if you remember them, right? And it should be pretty clear from going through the PowerPoint slides what I'm going to be emphasizing. There's going to be a couple of questions that are from the book that I didn't have a chance to cover. And also, certainly, I think there's at least 5 questions from discussion section that are not covered by me or much of the book either. Once we click to start to begin, is there a password? Nope, no password. You just say start the exam and off you go. And you're given 80 minutes. I think there's a timer there. If not, you can time it yourself just to be sure. But it's very, very straightforward. It's actually, you know, it's much more straightforward than we used to do in class, where everyone had to have a Scantron and do it that way. This is great. Well, this will be very straightforward. Okay, I'm going to have to start lecturing now. Your TAs are great people to ask questions of, and you'll have a chance tomorrow and Monday about the exam. Okay, this is where we left off. So we're talking about smell. And we started moving into subliminal odors. So we did discuss some of the things that we can do consciously, say if we're asked to like smell a t-shirt and be able to recognize our siblings and our friends, romantic partners, and that sort of thing. But now what we're talking about is how odors that we are not aware of might have some effect on us. And as I said, this is one of the great things about the smell research is that our impression is that when you first go into a room, you might smell things, but you don't really smell things for very long. You know, after a while, we habituate. I think there used to be a commercial commercial on TV where it says we become smell blind, and that's functionally true. We don't consciously notice it. But even after that occurs, our brains are always processing smells in a room, even without our awareness of it. And that's what the rest of this discussion is really going to be about, the subliminal odors that affect us, right? So your brain is constantly using odors, most of which never reach us. And there's a lot of experiments that have shown that now. Of course, I've been talking about the Mark Peltier and Eileen Kenny as kind of an interesting way to learn about that. But you can read more about that in the book if you're interested. Anyway, let me talk a little bit about some of these experiments. These are in the book. If I go a little fast now, you can always go back to the book. But imagine yourself sitting in a room, and you're asked first in an experiment to just do some math problems that maybe take 15 minutes or so. Unbeknownst to you, there is a very, very weak odor of strawberry. So weak that you don't have a conscious awareness of it as you're taking the test. Okay, then you're done. And your next part of the experiment, I think they say it's probably a separate experiment or something, is that you're basically going to do what Eileen Kenny does, which is to find a smell that would fit with different rooms on campus, say. Okay, you haven't been to a lot of rooms on campus, I realize that, but you know what they'll look like pretty much, right? And so you start seeing pictures. You see pictures of a theater. You see pictures of a lecture hall. You see pictures of a small laboratory. All these sort of rooms that are on campus, and you're given smells that are put in front of you, and you're asked to say which smell works best with these rooms. It's a hard thing to do, but you do your best. You guess. I don't know. Maybe lilac goes with the theater. I don't know. Maybe some sort of citrus smell goes with a laboratory room. You do your best, you guess. And then you're shown a picture of the room you were just in. And even though you weren't aware of smelling strawberry while you were in that room, guess which smell you're most likely to choose? Yeah, strawberry. And you continue with that. And then at the end, they'll say, okay, now before you leave, we want to make sure of something. When you were taking that math test, did you smell anything? Everybody in the experiment says no. I was just taking the math test. I was concentrating on that. I didn't smell a thing. I didn't start smelling things until you put me in that other room and started testing me, asked me to match smells. So you are kind of subliminally, you're kind of unconsciously associating that strawberry smell with that room, even though the strawberry wasn't strong enough for you to have a conscious association like that. All right, another experiment. And I think this one's really cool. This was one that was really fun to read about and to read how they did this. This is very cool. My wife's really interested in this because, it's all men besides her, and the house can get a little messy if she's not around. So I told her about this. She said, oh, maybe there's a way we can set this up in the house. Here's the idea. You go to a laboratory room, and basically, you're asked to do a number of tests. Maybe the first one is another mathematics task. It really has nothing to do with what they're interested in. But there is a very weak odor of a cleaning solution. Now, maybe a pine sol isn't the best one. I mean, maybe pine sol might just be so strong it's detectable. But you could imagine another maybe dishwashing liquid or some sort of maybe more mild sort of soap that would be in the room where they could kind of make it very, very faint. They could make it barely noticeable. Okay, and that's exactly what they did. And then they asked them to do a number of things. One thing they asked them to do was to look on a computer screen and determine whether what they're seeing, a string of letters, forms a word or is a non-word. That's all they have to do, word, non-word. Okay, and they see words coming up like table, word, and they see another thing come up and it's like blah, 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 and that's a non-word. And they just do this for a while. Okay, and people are good at it. They're almost always accurate, but the job, of course, is to do it as quickly and as accurately as possible, right? But here's what they slip into that list. They slip in words that have to do with cleaning. And when those words come up, I don't know, mop, soap, shower, something like that. When those words come up, you're actually faster at responding to those words that have to do with cleaning because you've had this subliminal, unconscious smell of cleaning in the room. Okay. I forgot to mention there's going to be another group of subjects that they're not going to get the cleaning smell. Okay, there's not going to be any smell at all, right? Both groups don't smell anything consciously, but one group is getting something subliminally presented to them. And they're the ones that are going to recognize the cleaning-related words faster. So word reading is one of the things that's affected by this subliminal, what we say is priming, kind of, putting our subjects in a context of clean. And it works well. What else? Okay, you're done with that task. This gets really fun now. And you said, okay, terrific, thank you. We're going to go out and get give you your receipt for being in the experiment, your credit receipt. But before we do, we just wanted to know what you have planned for the rest of the day. Okay, what are you going to do after you leave the lab today? And people say, oh, I'm going to eat lunch, and they say the normal things. But the group that has the subliminal odor, the non-detectable odor of cleaning, okay, are more likely to say that their plans for the rest of the day involve something to do with cleaning. Well, I got to eat lunch, and then I got to drop something off at the registrar's office, but then I got to go back to my dorm room and I've got to clean it up. I've been putting that off for days, right? Or, well, I guess today's the day I'm going to finally get to my laundry. The group that had the subliminal smell are more likely to say they have plans that have to do with cleaning, which is pretty cool. I told my wife this. She thought that was very, very cool. Okay. What else? The last thing's great. So, okay, here's your credit slip. Thank you very much. And guess what we have for you for being in the experiment? We have a cookie. So go ahead, and if you don't mind it, you're not allowed to take the cookie out of here, but would you mind eating this cookie here? Now, this is fun. What you do is you have a little camera in the room, and they're told that there's a camera just watching them perform just to make sure everything's going well. But the camera now records them eating the cookie, right? And the question is the group that has this unconscious odor going to clean the cookie up more, cleaning the crumbs up after they're done eating, more than the group that does not have the odor? And the answer is yes. If you're in the group that has this undetectable, very, very subtle odor that you can't consciously be aware of, you will clean up the crumbs with your little napkin more so than if you're in the group that doesn't have that smell. So, and again, after the experiment, I should mention, this is going to be true of all these experiments. Afterwards, everybody is interviewed about what they thought the experiment was about. It's something we kind of commonly do in research anyway. And they are asked right off the bat, did you ever smell anything in the room? And whether you were in the room that didn't have anything any smell or did have any smell, you're going to say no, because it's below the level of your threshold, below consciousness. So when you're being influenced like this, unconsciously, okay, below your level of awareness, it does affect, first of all, how you respond to clean-related words, how you kind of discuss your plans for the day, and how much cookie crumb cleaning you do at the end of the experiment. By the way, I should mention, they then ran another group that actually had the cleaning odor in the room, and they did not show these effects at all. Right? They did not show that cleaning words were primed and the plans had to do it. These things, this effect had to have happened kind of at an unconscious level. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, you're looking back at the top of that slide and you're thinking, my gosh, Steve Wynn, the guy who owns the Mirage, and the other folks that were saying maybe there's something to do with a smell that coerces you into doing something you don't want to do. And here you do have certainly an unconscious influence over behavior, but it is subtle behavior. First of all, everyone's pretty polite when they clean up their cookie. Okay, I was trying to kind of, make it a very kind of stark contrast, but everyone cleans up their cookie pretty well. But boy, the folks that have the unconscious smell, they'll clean every last crumb, right? But everything else is a very subtle effect. So yes, in fact, you do have subtle effects, but a smell isn't going to coerce you into gambling if you don't want to gamble, right? It isn't going to coerce you into falling in love with somebody that you don't want to fall in love with. It's very subtle, but we'll see more of these effects as we go on. I think you'll find them interesting. Okay, for example, fear. This is really interesting, if I can say so myself, right? And again, we're doing the same type of thing. We're going to be presenting an undetectable smell of fear. So what does fear smell like? It's actually very straightforward. What you do is you take a sample of a person who's put in a fearful situation. And that's what you're seeing here. Absolutely. You can, sometimes it's taken from folks that are riding a roller coaster. Sometimes it's taken from folks who are taking an exam. Usually it's an important exam like a, SAT or an MCAT or something like that. And they say, sure, you can take a little swab of my sweat if you want to, and they'll do that. And then they'll bring it back to the lab, and they will present it to people in the lab. So it's the smell of somebody else's fear in the laboratory. Now, just so you know some of the details, it is usually men, it's usually stressed men that these samples are taken from. And they're presented to both men and women in the lab without their awareness. I won't get into the technical details of how it's done, but it comes through. They're consciously smelling something else, like an alcohol smell, like rubbing alcohol smell, but underneath it, undetectable beyond the rubbing alcohol, is in fact the smell of somebody who's nervous, somebody who is stressed from a roller coaster or a test. So you do that, you present that to a group of subjects. Another group of subjects is not going to get that smell, so we can compare. The group of subjects that is presented to show some really interesting fear-related behaviors. They're subtle. Again, I want to make sure I say these are very subtle things, but they're interesting. They're measurable. For example, imagine seeing a group of faces like this. And actually, this isn't really exactly what's shown, but one face at a time is shown. And some of these faces are neutral, and some of them are more negative. I don't see, are there any negative ones here? Nah, I have to get a better example of this. This is just the one that I was able to access quickly. But imagine you're seeing faces that are neutral, and then they slowly, there's a group of faces, and as you go from one to the next, it's the same person, but their faces maybe frown a little bit or look a tiny bit scared. And the question is, as subjects in this experiment are looking at the faces, are they likely to say it's a neutral expression, or is it a happy expression, or is it a negative expression, a positive expression or a negative expression? If in fact those are the subjects that are being presented the undetectable smell from a stressed man, here's what happens. It influences their perception of facial expressions. So the ones that would typically be seen as neutral, say by another group of subjects who weren't getting that stress smell, they are interpreted as more negative. So if you are getting a subliminal, undetectable smell of somebody else who is stressed, it makes you interpret facial expressions as more negative. What else does it do? Well, something called the startle reflex. And you want an example of the startle reflex? Here you go. Okay, like that? Isn't that cool? All right. Did you blink when I did that? Okay. Did you blink? That's a startle reflex. Basically, it's the reflex one has when they hear a loud, sharp sound. Okay, that's what's being portrayed down there where that eye is blinking. Okay, so it's a very well-studied reflex. It's pretty easy to study. You can have a little videotape and see how quickly someone blinks and how strongly someone blinks. Right? Is it a light blink or is it like that type of thing? As they hear a loud sound. So it takes a loud sound to kind of induce this. But then what you can do is you can kind of slowly change how strong and how quick the reflex is if you include the subliminal odor of somebody else's fear. And that's what that means by it amplitudes the startle reflex. We all have a startle reflex from this terrible sound. Right? There, I just did it. But if I were simultaneously being presented the odor of somebody else's fear without being able to consciously detect it, my startle reflex would be bigger and faster than if I wasn't getting that undetectable odor. So it doesn't induce the startle reflex on its own, but the sound does that. But it can amplify it. The smell, the undetectable smell of somebody else's fear can amplify the target reflex. Let me see, did I take this off the slide? No, I didn't. I'm going to skip this because it's a little technical and it's not that important. So what this says here enhances word task vigilance. If you're interested in it, read it in the book, but it will not be on the exam. I've got to skip around a little bit today. Anyway, let's talk about the facial expressions and the startle amplification of the startle reflex. This works for pretty much everybody. If you are presenting an undetectable smell from somebody else that's been scared, it will amplify the startle reflex and it will induce people to interpret neutral expressions as more negative. But it does so even more so for anxious sniffers. Okay, it's even larger. So I can be an anxious person sometimes. I'm sure some of you folks can. We are actually more affected by this than folks that aren't anxious. Everyone has some effect of undetectable smell, fierce smell, but those of us that are anxious probably have a little bit more of that, which is interesting. Okay, so what does this say? Well, it says a few things. First of all, I, again, don't want to kind of, try to push this too hard. These are very subtle effects in humans. These are subtle effects. So again, getting an undetectable smell of fear does not induce the startle reflex. It just makes it a little bit bigger, okay? It doesn't make you see everybody as having a negative expression. The neutral ones, maybe you're more likely to say it's a negative expression, which is very different from what happens with animals. This is kind of a very weakened version of what happens in animals. So, but let's talk about what happens in animals. This is interesting. Ants, mice, deer, amoeba, cockroaches, that sort of thing, right? If they smell another, animals smell, another insect smell. Let's talk about cockroaches or ants, for example. Okay, here I am, Rosenblum the ant. That's what I'll be for Halloween. I'm walking around, and all of a sudden, I get to a point where another ant has been scared. That ant released an odor, and that scares me. That smell scares me to the point where I go, whoa, and I run the other way. Okay. Same thing will happen with mice, deer, and even amoeba. They will drastically change their behavior. A mouse smelling another mouse's fear, yeah, it will leave the room. It will leave the area pretty quickly. It seems almost reflexive in a way, so almost as if they really can't help it. It's like, whoa, I'm out of here. Okay, that is an instance where, yeah, the smell of another animal's fear has a large effect, right? That's a large reaction. But that is not what happens with us. We probably have something like the remnants of what these other animals have, right? We have something like the leftovers of what happens, okay? So I want to be sure that we're talking about things that you understand, that we're talking about things that are much more subtle than what happens with animals, because animals will almost reflexively do a major sort of reaction when they smell another animal's fear. Of course, we don't know whether it's something they experience consciously or unconsciously. Animals can't tell us that type of thing, but we certainly can watch their behavior. And if you want to scare a cockroach out of your kitchen, scare another cockroach and leave it, put a cockroach in the middle, scare it so it runs. Other cockroaches will not go to that area, at least in principle. Okay, let's take a little break here and do a question. Let's see what your questions are first. I'm going to have to go through your questions more quickly than usual, just so you know. Let's do that. Good. I'm getting a lot of test questions still. Okay, no practice tests. If you lose the Wi-Fi connection, Vanessa, okay, email me immediately and I'll see what I can do about that. I should be able to restart the exam. However, I take down your name and I make sure that never happens again. So please, I know a lot of you don't have the best connections in the world, but put yourself as much as possible into a situation where that won't happen. Because if it keeps happening over and over again, I have to start getting worried that you're not kind of following the rules. What happens if you do lose the connection is you don't get to take the whole 80 minutes again. You have whatever time is left over. But I want to make sure that people are being honest about this. So please try to keep the connection as best as possible. Oh, Febreze is a great thing to do that experiment with. It's a Febreze commercial. Oh, the cookie experiment. Or Febreze is the nose blind one. That's great. How do they create an environment to collect sweat from the scared men? Typically, if you look at the literature, they either get it right after somebody's on a roller coaster, or they get it in an exam like an MCAT. People are taking exams that have a large influence on their life. They're nervous. There's no question about that. What is an anxious sniffer? Me. No, it just means that people who have a little bit more anxiety or a little bit higher in the anxiety scale are even more likely to have a larger startle response or perceive faces as negative. Okay, is this why when other people get scared, it also causes us to get scared? Casey, it's a great question, and I am hesitant to say. Yes, I will say maybe, because I don't know if there are other reasons people kind of catch another person's scared fear, but smell might, in fact, be one of the things involved. Very good question. Do you think that since dogs have a better sense of smell, that they can smell our emotions and therefore comfort us? Great question. Gilani, I don't know offhand. Like the subliminal study where the flash of pics in it. Picture right after. Okay, great. Yes, so Betul says the subliminal odor test is one like a study where subliminal pictures are shown, flash of pictures. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about face perception. That's great. And then you're asked questions about the picture. Hopefully, what I'm talking about now, and what I'll be talking about for the majority of the course, are situations where people can't actually consciously report very much about that subliminal presentation. Okay, Jason, again, the hat cap leg cup thing, I want you to ignore. It's in the book if you're interested, but I don't have time to discuss it now. Let's do a polling question. I know I'm going super fast today, but aren't we having fun? All right. Oh, this one's going to be easy. Okay, here's your question. One way to get someone to clean up a few more cookie crumbs is to one, present them with a strong, noticeable odor of cookies. 2, present them with a weak, undetectable odor of cookies. 3, present them with a strong, noticeable smell of a cleaning fluid, cleaning item. Or 4, present them with a weak, undetectable odor of a cleaning fluid. I think you know what the answer is. Let's see. I'm going to give you less time on your polling questions today. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds. It doesn't make a difference. I'm going to give you the answer anyway. It's important you get the question, in your notes so you can do well on the exam. I'm going to stop it here. Okay, and I understand only 75% of you voted. That's no problem. The correct answer is, in fact, what is going on here? Yes. I'm not seeing a bar here for this. I hope you are, but the correct answer is D. You present them with a weak, undetectable odor of the cleaning fluid, okay? If it's strong, they typically will not be influenced by it, okay? It's a weak subliminal odor that induces this sort of thing. An odor of cookies has nothing to do with it, okay? Whether it's a detectable or undetectable odor of cookies, it's an undetectable odor of the cleaning fluid that will induce people to clean up more cookie crumbs. Take a picture of it if you haven't, and let's continue. Great. Okay, let's talk about I think one of the most interesting aspects of odor, and you're going to see how this is going to work into how we're going to kind of integrate everything we've talked about with regard to odor by the end. This woman you're looking at right now is Martha McClintock, and she's a fascinating character, kind of very famous, especially for doing research on what was initially a controversial topic. And that has to do with something probably some of you have noticed before, where if you're living with somebody, a woman, if you're a woman and living with another woman, or in a house with women, that you might notice your menstrual cycles will entrain. What I mean by entrain is they end up kind of matching each other, so you all go through the menstrual part of your cycle at the same time. Okay, I'm sure some of you have heard of this, if not experienced it yourself, right? And she noticed it by just living in a dorm. I mean, this was her undergraduate thesis. And she was, her responsibility was to go out and get the sanitary supplies for her dorm, which was an all-women's dorm, by the way, at Wellesley College. And she was noticing that, yeah, it seems like after people are living together for a few months, 4 months, I think she determined, it seems like their cycle is in fact matching up, all right? Which is interesting because it's something you'll see later. It is something we've known about mice and other animals, pigs, deer, that sort of thing, that their cycles do seem to link up. They seem to, what we call entrain. The cycle is kind of are at the same time after a while. Okay. And it doesn't start like that. They're all coming from different places as they move in and living with their families and everything. And so when they first get there, their cycles won't match up. But after a few months, for certainly, it seems like they do. Okay. So how does this happen? Well, it was known at the time, and this is God, back in the 70s, I can't remember offhand. It was known at the time that it is, in fact, something to do with odor. That in order for those mice, those female mice, to entrain their cycles, they have to be close enough to smell each other, and their smell systems have to be intact. We call those pheromones, by the way. That we know animals kind of send out these odors to each other that kind of affect each other. They're kind of like signalers, or they're pheromones that can influence each other's kind of metabolism, as it does in this case. Is that what's going on with people? She published this as an undergraduate, so brave. I mean, this is a pretty kind of radical sort of observation, and it was a little bit controversial, as I said. Don't worry about these details, really. I'll just let you know it was controversial. Part of it just has to do with she got her data by asking women when their cycles were, and it could be that when they were reporting, when their menstrual week was, that they were really kind of thinking of their roommates or their dorm mates or something like that. So it was criticized for that reason. But it was criticized for the big reason that we didn't think that people were subject to these pheromones that we knew about animals, that we knew worked in animals. So it was, kind of a challenging sort of observation that she was making. So she went to graduate school and continued to study this. And then when she got to graduate school, one of the first experiments she did was to actually present the odors of other women to women that were, going through their cycles normally. Okay, so she took sweat. This is really kind of interesting. She took sweat from women that were ovulating or were going just before their ovulation phase of their cycle. Okay. And she took these samples, I believe, from the underarms of these women. And then what she did is she took these two samples and presented them to two new groups of women. One group of women got the ovulation sweat sample, and the other group got the pre-ovulation sweat sample. And it was presented in a kind of a clever way. They were not told, by the way, anything about the experiment. The receivers of the sweat were not told anything about what was going on. They were just telling them, I think what they did is they put it again in like a rubbing alcohol, right? So the only thing you could smell was rubbing alcohol. So they had them come into the lab, and she kind of dabbed their upper lip with rubbing alcohol. And they said, okay, we're just going to clean your lip now. And I can't remember what the cover story was. But they were actually getting a little sweat from an ovulating woman or a pre-ovulating woman. Okay, yeah, so it was in fact applied to the upper lips, right? Okay, and the question was, after this was done daily, I think, for a woman for a month, did it have any effect on the receiver women's cycle? And in fact, it did. That it shifted the cycle 2 to 3 days in one direction or the other direction, depending on if they got the ovulation sweat or the pre-ovulation sweat. Don't worry about which direction it went in, but it did shift it in one direction. In other words, the cycle was shifted up a few days, I guess, if they got the ovulation sweat, or maybe it was the other way around. Or it was shifted back. Their cycle was shifted back a few days if they got the pre-ovulation sweat. And this time she was clever. What she did is she actually tested for the time of the month they were actually in by taking temperatures and swabs of things and all that sort of stuff. So it was not a self-report sort of experiment. But here you have an example where the sweat of one woman has a direct effect on the sweat of another woman, even though the receiving women did not know what was going on. I mean, it's I think a pretty compelling example of of a pheromone. Now, again, the women that were receiving the smell had no idea that the smell was there. They just thought they were getting their upper lips cleaned by rubbing alcohol or something like that. But that odor, undetectable, was there and did shift their cycle in one direction or the other, depending on which of the two odors they got, which is pretty darn cool. Okay, so now let's take this idea of pheromones, the idea that an odor from one person can affect something in the other person, and look to see how it's been discussed with animals and whether there are analogous things that happen with people. It's still a controversial idea, but I think it's become less controversial as you'll see us go on with this. Okay, what I'm going to do is talk about different types of pheromones that are known to exist for animals, for mice, for deer, all these sort of things. Okay, one is called a primer pheromone. What is a primer pheromone? A primer pheromone is exactly what we're talking about now. It is the type of pheromone that can influence another animal's or possibly another person's kind of metabolism to change. The kind of bodily sort of processes they go through. And we know they exist for mice, as I said. Yes, mice entrain their menstrual cycles based on these smells, okay? Based on these smells that are secreted by other mice. It absolutely exists for mice. It exists for many, many other mammals that have been tested. There's no question, and we know it goes through their smell system. Okay, what else? The other type that's been discussed with animals very often is called a releaser pheromone. And this is a different type of reaction that animals have to what we call releaser pheromone. It's a kind of reflexive. And one of the most well-known ones is called a mating stance, and it's very often tested in pigs, such that if a female pig that's in estrus smells the smell of a male pig nearby, it will automatically take a mating stance. It will go into its mating position to, make it easier for piggies to have baby piggies, right? You get the idea, right? So a releaser pheromone, it doesn't have that kind of subtle shifting of the menstrual cycle effect. It kind of induces almost a reflexive sort of behavior in a receiving animal. The other one's ant scattering. We talked about this one. We know that when an ant smells another ant's fear, it runs for its little ant life, right? And that is another example, very likely, of a releaser pheromone as it exists in ants. And we know that's through smell, one secreting a smell and the other one being affected by it. But this is a very different type of reflex. Clearly, releaser pheromones probably don't apply to humans, right? I mean, we talked about the fear smell, and the fear smell doesn't make us run for our lives, right? As humans, the fear smell amplifies the startle reflex and makes us interpret neutral facial expressions more negatively. But, we don't run for our lives. We don't go into mating stances when we smell things. It's a very different thing for people. And often it makes scientists say, see, people aren't reactive to pheromones, right? They're animal sorts of things, this kind of pheromone communication. What about humans? Is there any evidence for this? Well, possibly, right? So, we talked about the primer one, and maybe if Martha McClintock's correct and her research continues to hold up, yeah, women show menstrual entrainment. There's still a little controversy, and you can look in the book about what that is, if you're interested. Not something you're responsible for. But you also might know that when a woman moves in with a man, okay, even if it's not a romantic partner, it likely will, what we say, regularizes her menstrual cycle, right? So if a woman has kind of a menstrual cycle that's sometimes 28 days, sometimes 32 days, it doesn't seem that consistent from month to month. If they move in with a man, it typically regularizes it. Might that also have to do with pheromones? Possibly. I think that's been studied too by Martha and her colleagues, which is interesting. But this releaser idea, I mean, it seems pretty far-fetched for humans to have a response to a releaser pheromone here, right? So, again, we don't go into mating stances when we smell, someone of the opposite or same sex, I suppose. We don't scatter when we smell somebody's fear. The only example, and I talk about this in the book, is that if you take a newborn infant, and there's one right there, and then you take the smell of its mom, and I think that's what's being shown right here, a little swab, that the infant will kind of start doing a little infant wriggle to kind of move towards it as best as it can. And it seems kind of like a reflex. When you're dealing with people, it's hard kind of to determine whether that type of behavior is reflexive or not, right? Does the child have a choice to do it? And in animals, it seems like they don't have much choice at all. Okay, but that's just some idea of what might be going on. But what Martha says, and I think this is really insightful, that when you talk about people, you are actually going to have to talk about a different type of pheromone. That these ideas, this releaser and primer pheromone, these are classes that might be, when you talk about people, too restrictive. They might not actually encompass how pheromones might work with people. Okay? So, for example, she suggests that we should consider some of the effects we've been talking about already in class as something called signaler pheromones. These would be pheromones, she would say, that would kind of signal to other people something about the person whose odor is being given off, right? So maybe when we talked before about, being able to recognize your kin or somebody's possible reproductive potential, which we'll talk more about, but hopefully you're remembering something about MHC right now and that complementarity of immune systems. Maybe when people are making those sort of judgments with t-shirts, they're actually getting what we could, I guess, categorize as a signaler pheromone. It's not going to make you run for the hills or establish a mating stance. It's not going to induce some sort of menstrual cycle changes or something like that. But it could signal, hey, this is a sibling. This is a child of mine. This is a woman or a man, which is something else, as it turns out, we can do. This person has a good smelling t-shirt. They provide. They could provide me healthy offspring. Okay, that might be what we're talking about in all these t-shirt tests. What's going on is the pheromone is acting as information that doesn't have to necessarily be acted on. You're not going to necessarily marry somebody for their smell, right? But it does give off that information. What else? Modulator pheromones. And what these might be are the sort of pheromones that can kind of induce changes, but not ones that are reflexive, right? They could maybe modify a person's mood a little bit, their emotion a little bit. Like we saw when we were discussing the fear-inducing odors from somebody else that was scared, right? So we smelled the smell of a man who had taken an exam, and it doesn't make us run for the hills, as I said. What it does is it makes our reflex to the startle reflex from a loud noise a little bit larger, and it makes us interpret faces maybe as a little bit more negative. So by adding these to the possible types of pheromones that we're discussing, now maybe we can talk about pheromones being something that is part of what goes on with humans to some degree. Clearly, signaler pheromones, modulator pheromones are more subtle than the type that is typically discussed with animals, the releaser and primer. But maybe they're just as real in some ways. So let's talk about some possible signaler pheromone effects. We've already talked about some of these, right? Remember MHC compatibility, right? So the complementarity of the immune systems allows there to be stronger offspring immunity. And in fact, I won't go through this again, we've already gone through it, but I will tell you something about animals. In fact, animals seem to choose mates that have this sort of complementarity in immune systems, right? So, you find a husband and wife mouse, part of a mice family, and you test their MHCs, and yes, they have complementary systems. And the same with birds, fish, and lizards. Now, you're thinking, should we do this with people? Should we look at the MHC compatibility in husbands and wives, for example, right? And you're thinking, boy, maybe I should do this with my romantic partner right now. In fact, you can do it online if you want to, but don't. And I'll tell you why. Because when you look at that, it doesn't really show that much. It doesn't show that human couples choose each other based on MHC compatibility alone, at least. Okay. However, when it comes to sniffing a t-shirt, it does seem to have an effect. Remember, we've already talked about this. Women sniffing men's t-shirts will often like the one that has that's from a man that has an MHC that kind of fills in the holes of her sort of immune system. Okay, that's one thing. What else? Well, this gets a little hairy here, but I think you'll find this really interesting. Okay. It is predictive, at least for college students, about what the likelihood of a woman's extra relationship affair will be, as well as her sexual fantasies. Okay, so don't make too much of this. Okay, this is still being studied, but as it turns out, if a woman is with a man who doesn't have that kind of complementarity in her MHC, if in fact there's too much kind of overlap, kind of too much redundancy in the immune systems between them, then she is more likely to have an affair outside the relationship, and she is more likely to have fantasies about other men. Okay. All right. So this is a very loaded sort of set of results, but it does exist. These results do exist. They've been replicated. It doesn't necessarily mean that a woman's going to have an affair if she's with a man that has a less than, kind of complementary immune system or something like that. But this data does exist, and it seems to exist mostly for young people. I don't think that necessarily holds as people get older. It also seems to be a stronger effect. Women will have more fantasies, and will be more likely to have extra relationship affairs if the MHC isn't complementary during ovulation. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I know it's controversial. I see there's a lot of questions on this. That's great. That's no problem at all. We can address at least some of those. But the idea is that possibly this sort of thing is actually based on subliminal odor as well. So these might be the signaler pheromones, right? They're not just signaling, things like, whether somebody's my offspring or somebody's in my family, my siblings or something like that. It might also signal something having to do with the potential of a mate to create healthy offspring with oneself. Okay. Clearly, a lot more goes into mate selection, so I don't want to overvalue this. I think the most interesting thing for me is that, like animals, this is something that is kind of an undercurrent, or I guess animals seem to be ruled pretty strongly by these things. The fact that we are still being affected by these things might be some sort of kind of evolutionary holdover, but it's something that's interesting and is still part of our kind of, our perceptual repertoire in one way or another, and it does have, some measurable influences. Okay, let's take a break, look at the questions. People are going nuts. Should I test my boyfriend? Should I test my girlfriend? Okay. Okay. All right. I'm pretty sure mental synchrony as a hypothesis has gone under a lot of scrutiny. Menstrual synchrony under a lot of scrutiny in terms of its validity. Absolutely, Cynthia. You can go online and see this. When I wrote this part, and I certainly talk about the controversy a little bit in the chapter, but I was very careful because this is a controversial topic. Part of it has to do with the idea that we assume that animals have an organ in their olfactory system, in their smell system, that is there to detect these things, and we have never found that organ in humans. It doesn't, however, mean that the human brain doesn't make use of this. Okay, yes. I think I remember a high school psych teacher saying that men can smell our fertility. We'll get to that in just a second. Thank you for that, Anna. Yes, did they take into account things like birth control? Absolutely. I think I might mention some of those things in the book. Thank you for that question, David. Can you give other examples of primer pheromones? Yes, I will in just a second. There's a perfume for women that enhances their natural pheromones and apparently makes them more attractive. My recommendation here is that there's no evidence that anything that has ever been put on the market does anything like that claim. Okay. In principle, something like this might work, but you have to test this in the right way. It has to be one of those kind of like medical experiments where both the receiver and the experimenter are double blind. And I don't think anything like that has ever been done with a commercial product. I looked for things like that for the book. I said, nope, it ain't there yet. Maybe someday, but I would not spend your money on that as of yet. Okay. Has there been research for men as well as women? Okay, so you're starting to see something here, Jason, where there's a trend where a lot of this research seems to be conducted on women as kind of the receivers of the pheromone. And that is, at least in 2010, generally the case. And I think the idea was that women do seem to be somewhat more reactive, at least measurably. Nobody's crazily, reactive to, these smells. Again, you're not going to, establish a mating stance or run away from a smell or something like that. But it seems to have these subtle effects. To the degree these effects exist, these subtle effects seem to be more systematically observed in women, at least as of 2010. It's a great question. Let's do a polling question. I feel bad having to go through this so quickly. It's so interesting. Yeah, okay. Now, I've been saying that over and over again. Let me give you the shoot, let me give you this one instead. Okay. Yeah, good. Okay, here's the question. Applying female sweat to the upper lip of a woman can A, shorten their menstrual cycle by 2 to 3 days, B, lengthen their menstrual cycle by 2 to 3 days, C, lengthen their menstrual cycle by 1 month, or D, both A and B. It should be very cinchy. Just look back at the previous slide and you'll get it. Great. Oh, you're doing good. I'm going to give you 15 seconds. You're all getting it anyway. I just want to be able to, give you the questions so you have it available when you're studying. You're not getting graded on it anyway. All right. Terrific. 86% of you got the correct answer. It can shift at 2 to 3 days in either direction, depending on whether you get the ovulation smell or the pre-ovulation smell. So it can go both ways. That's what that graph showed. It's what I said. So the correct answer is both A and B. D. It cannot shift it by an entire month. That's these are very subtle shifts. Even for mice, I don't think you can do something like that. I don't think you can shift it for more than a few days one way or another, just so you know. But yeah, there is a systematic shift depending on which of the odors you're actually getting. Great. Terrific. Let's continue. Well, okay, there's one more question. That's again, a primer pheromone is the type of pheromone that is going to kind of induce some sort of major kind of reflexive behavior. And the primer pheromones would be the pig going into its little piggy mating stance, or an ant getting scared by smelling another ant's fear and running for its little ant life. Okay, let's continue then with our discussion. And I'm going to talk about another type of signaling pheromone here. It has to do with symmetry. And, when you look at animals and when you look at people, as you can see there in the picture that's of that face right there, you can see things about the animal's symmetry. And what I mean about symmetry here is whether they're left and right sides, whether we're talking about a human face, whether we're talking about limbs and legs and things like that. If there are certain types of asymmetries in an animal that are visible, typically, that animal will probably have slower growth. It will probably not live as long, and it will probably not be as fertile. So, if you're buying horses for mating, or for breeding and dogs and things like that, that is something that these folks will look at very carefully. They'll look at the face of the dog, they'll look at the legs, they'll make sure it's as symmetric as possible, because that property of what can be seen in the symmetry between the two sides of an animal will predict something about how long that animal will live and how fertile they'll be. And it probably has something to do with resistance to disease or something like that. Now, importantly, I know, this is the sort of temptation where you want to run up to the mirror now and look to make sure your hands are the same size and all that sort of stuff. We're not talking about perfect symmetry, okay? And even if you've been in an accident or something like that, or you've broken part of your jaw or something, you're not going to be perfectly symmetrical. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a type of asymmetry that is pretty dramatic and is probably based on your genetic background more than anything else, right? This is definitely true of animals. It also seems to be true of people. So low body or face symmetry, as you're seeing here in this gentleman right here, okay, is also predictive of lower IQs, as well as worse physical and mental health. Okay, these aren't huge sorts of differences, but they are differences, and it's something that doctors know very well, and they it is something that is looked for sometimes. But again, we're talking about major asymmetries. Again, don't think you're asymmetric when you look in the mirror. Chances are you're here at UCR, you're going to be fine. Okay. But, if you want to find faces that are less symmetric, sometimes looking at mugshots, you'll find a lot of that, okay, for whatever reason. Okay. What does this have to do with smell? We're getting there. We're getting there. There's a couple of other things I want to say about symmetry in humans. Higher body symmetry, so people who are measured as being very symmetric are, get this, likely to have more sexual partners, and if men are more likely to induce copulatory orgasms in women. Okay, so these are kind of odd ways of measuring. What are we looking for here? But this is something that's known. So with low symmetry, you're less likely to have many sexual partners and not induce copulatory orgasms. But high symmetry, yes, there seems to be like that, right? Now, smell. What does this have to do with smell? It seems that smell allows a woman, at least, to detect symmetry kind of indirectly. Okay, so especially if they're in their fertile phase, a woman will like the smell of a symmetric man's t-shirt better. Okay, so you get a t-shirt from this dude right here whose face isn't very symmetric. And let's see, Brad Pitt probably has a perfectly symmetrical face, right? That's how he makes the big bucks, whatever. They'll be more likely to like this natural smell of Brad Pitt than this gentleman here. And that, it seems, is correlated with facial symmetry and probably bodily symmetry as well. So the appealingness, the how much a odor is liked by a woman seems to be correlated with symmetry. Probably what's going on here is genetic health. Probably what is a smell that is considered pleasant to a woman, a man's natural smell that is considered pleasant to a woman, is reflecting something of the man's genetic health. Genetic health, as I said before, bears also on symmetry. So there's two ways now a woman potentially could judge, unconsciously, of course, the genetic health of a man. One is by the pleasantness of their odor, and the other is by the symmetry. And those two things are correlated. Those two things seem to go hand in hand. And so you can test how, whether there is a correlation between symmetry just by measuring people and the pleasantness of their smell as judged by women. And there absolutely is. This seems to actually increase when the woman is going through ovulation. Okay, as I said, it kind of heightens her sensitivity to this. And one more thing. When women are going through this phase, they not only like the smell of a symmetric man better, but they like the smell of what you might say is a dominant man better. Okay, so you probably know a little bit about this. There's ways of kind of evaluating, in a group of men, what we say is the alpha man, the beta man, all that sort of stuff. That stuff, got to take that with a grain of salt. What does that mean? And certainly, the alpha men in high school very often don't turn out to be the alpha men when they're in their 30s. That stuff can change, absolutely, right? But if, in a college dorm, in my son's fraternity house, my son's definitely the alpha male. I'm kidding. You can look at the relationship between the people, and then you have them take questionnaires and say, who would you consider the leader of the group, that sort of thing. Supposedly, the research shows that women can smell that women, especially during their fertile phase, will find the smell of what we call a dominant man more pleasant. So not only can they smell symmetry, which is also smelling something about genetic health, they can smell something about the dominance. Now, somebody asked about men and this sort of thing, and here you go. Men, if you give t-shirts to men from women who are at various stages of their cycle, men will in fact like the smell of a fertile woman better. Okay, so you take a bunch of t-shirts that come from women who are going through their fertile phase versus their menstrual phase versus another part of the month, and men will show a small but measurable preference for the t-shirt smells that are coming from the women going through ovulation, which is interesting. It's very interesting because we always knew that animals signal each other when they're going through their fertile phases, right? You're certainly seeing that with that little monkey right there, right? They're kind of giving it away, right? Time to make babies. But we always thought women kind of hid that. And human women seem to hide that. Not intentionally, but that's just part of the biology. But here is an example where they don't seem to do that. They seem that it seems that it's not completely concealed, that at least at a probably unconscious level, they are signaling fertility to men, okay? At least to some degree. How much influence that actually has on behavior is unclear. But put in a position where you're in an experiment and you got to judge the relative pleasantnesses of the smell, it does seem to work like that. All right, we're going to go on now and talk about mood. So we talked about how singular pheromones can tell the receiver, the smeller, something about the person. And now we learned a lot of things you can tell about a person potentially from smelling. And now we're going to talk about how smell can affect mood. And so what we're talking about here, again, are modulator pheromones, something that's not just going to provide information, but going to have kind of a subtle effect. And it's not like a reflex of going into a mating stance or a reflex of running away when you smell something scary, but it's going to affect the mood. Certainly, we can kind of categorize this fear, this eye blink thing, the increase of the eye blink as one of these examples, right? But here's some more you think you're going to find interesting. What you can do is you can take what would be considered something like a chemical similar to the pheromone that men give off and give it to women at undetected levels. Again, the women don't know what the experiment's about. They think they're just getting a smell of rubbing alcohol, but deep down under there is this pheromone from a man. What you find is subtle changes in the women's mood and biology. It will elevate the woman's mood a little bit, okay, when she's getting this. So, there's probably some cover story about what the women think the experiment's about. They don't know this has to do with pheromones. They don't know they're getting a man's pheromone. But they fill out a form, and what type of mood are you in? While getting this odor, they will rate their mood as a little bit more positive. While getting this odor, it will increase their heart rate just a little bit. As the odor comes through at undetectable levels, they'll sweat a tiny, tiny bit more. Now, I'm talking about not even sweat you can see. You can put little things on the finger and measure the amount of moisture on the skin that's not detectable by the human eye, but they will sweat just a tiny bit more. And their cortisol levels, which you can measure by taking a swab of their saliva, will also increase a little bit. These are subtle effects that the women don't notice. Yeah, they say maybe their mood's a little better than it would have been if they were in the group that didn't get it, but we're talking about very subtle effects. They don't notice their heart rate's racing or they're sweating more or their cortisol levels are going up or anything like that. These are really, really subtle effects. But something else happens. If they are asked to watch romantic movies, I guess you'd say, very romantic with arousing scenes or something like that. I don't know, the 50 Shades of Grey movies. I don't know. I've never seen any of them. Maybe those are examples of these sort of movies. If they're watching those movies, and they maybe, get a little aroused from those movies, their level of arousal will be self-reported as a little bit higher if, in fact, they're getting the smell of a man. A man's pheromone. Okay. Again, what's inducing the sexual arousal is the film clip, seeing a sexy movie, right? But what seems to modulate it just a little bit, to increase it a little bit, is this a putative. What I mean by putative, it means it's kind of an assumed pheromone for men. It does have this subtle effect. Okay. Now, before you go crazy, and as I said, don't go out and buy these things. Because I don't think we're talking about really strong effects here. I think what we're talking about is something like the context of the situation, right? There's lots of things that make us feel, that put us more in the mood, right? You can light candles. If you're ready for a romantic evening, you can light candles. You can put on, oh yes, there it is right there, Marvin Gaye. I mean, that's the music we listen to in my generation to put us in the mood. I'm sure you listen to Bad Bunny or whatever to put you in the mood. I'm sure you don't. Maybe you listen to Marvin Gaye too to put you in the mood. Having a circular bed, that was really popular when I was a kid, not when I was an adult, but water beds were really great. Like, oh, he's got a water bed, she's got a water bed. This is going to put us in the mood. These are all subtle things. And boy, if you don't want to have a romantic relationship with somebody, you're not going to with these things around, right? You're not going to decide that, oh, there's Marvin Gaye, I can't help myself. There's a waterbed, I can't help myself. There's that undetectable smell, it's not like that at all. What we're talking about is romance, basically, that it acts like a context. It maybe kind of just modulated a little bit. Turning down the lights does the same thing, okay? And that's an important thing to realize. That's a very, very important thing to realize, that these aren't going to, that smells unlike what Steve Wynn might have thought, or the people that claim that the smell at the Mirage was coercing people into gambling. No, smells aren't going to make us do things we don't want to do. We don't have the reflexes like the mating stance and the ant, right? They're just going to be part of, a little nudge, like turning down the lights, putting on the Marvin Gaye, and warming up the waterbed. Okay, which is an important thing to acknowledge. So let's kind of do a concluding slide here. We've got 5 minutes. Our conclusion slide would be something like that. What about human pheromones? And what I have there, by the way, since somebody asked this, I have here just a picture of something that you can buy on the internet. It's called a TractMate pheromone concentrate. Again, there is no evidence, even if it's based on the chemistry of a male or female pheromone, there is no evidence that this really changes behavior. The claims that are on those websites are fictitious. Okay, I don't think they say anything about double-blind experiments. If they do, then I don't know about them, but or they're lying. But I would not go out and buy any of these things now, especially since these things are so subtle. What we do seem to have some evidence for, hopefully you realize now, is for signalers. It looks like, yes, we can make judgments about people based on the thing we're smelling, right? And maybe modulator, right? The fear thing seems to work. It makes our eye blinks kind of faster and stronger. It makes our our interpretation of neutral faces more negative, right? But they're very, very subtle. What about these other ones? Primer, yeah, well, if this research continues to stand up showing that menstrual entrainment occurs and menstrual cycle times can be shifted a little bit by being exposed to another woman's scent, yeah, that would be pretty nice support for that. What about releaser? What about this idea like the piggy? There you go, there's the piggy, or the ant. Okay, no, I don't think there's anything. I don't think there's no smell that will induce a reflexive response in us. It might change the mood a little bit, right? It might give us information. It might entrain our menstrual cycles a little bit, but it's not going to cause us to make love with somebody we don't want to make love with, or run away from something because somebody else is scared. It's going to have subtle effects, very, very subtle effects. In fact, when you go back and look at the piggy research, for example, it turns out that we don't know for certain if releaser of pheromones actually exist, because as it turns out with that piggy's case, Martha was the one that actually pointed this out to me. If you look at that research, it's not the case that the female pig, who's an estrus, just needs to smell the male pig. It's not like the odor's there. The female pig, in order to go into that stance, also needs to hear the pig or see the pig, the male pig, to go into that stance. So the idea that here's the odor, reflex happens, that might not be true even of animals. It's certainly not true for us. It might not be true for animals. It might be more like a modulator sort of influence for them. So the pig mating stance needs the right context. It needs sound at the very least. The female needs to hear the sound of a male nearby as well as the smell of a male nearby. The idea that these reflexes are completely reflexive and nothing else is involved might not be exactly right. So for humans, and possibly to some degree with animals, the influences of these subliminal odors that we're saying might be pheromones are not determinate. What I mean by that is they are not going to make us do anything we don't want to do, even gambling. Okay? If there's a nice smell in the lobby, you'll stay there because it's a nice smell, possibly, even after it wears off. But there's also a beautiful fish tank and a beautiful fake palm tree and lots of flashing lights and sounds. That will get you to stay there as much as any sort of undetectable odor, certainly. Okay, good. We have a couple of minutes for questions. I'll give you one more practice question just so you have it there. My computer has been lagging the entire... yes, Vanessa, the midterm will be available at 12 a.m. What about foods and taste? Do they have the same thing for arousal? Yeah, I think so. That's a really good question, Gabrielle. So can you, are there some foods that put people in the mood? You know, absolutely. And it probably is different for different people to some degree. That's a very good question. Maybe some type of dessert. Yeah, that's a great question. What if the woman is a lesbian, Carrie asks? And that's a very good question. When I was writing the book, there just started to be research on this with same-sex couples. And I don't know what the outcome of that research is, but I do remember there being a study, I don't think it made it into the book, where men would sit in a chair that an attractive man had sat in. Gay men would sit in the same chair that an attractive man had just sat on or something like that. And I wish I knew the details of it. But yeah, it'd be very interesting to ask these questions with same-sex relationships and things like that. Thanks, Jesus. Gave me an interesting compliment. All right, let's see. Something with same-sex couples. Yeah, thank you, Mia. People ask about that a lot. I wish I knew more about it. If you go online and you could probably find out a lot about that. And if you learn anything, I'd be happy to learn about it with you. So would dominant men be considered more symmetrical? That's a really good question, Andrea. I'm not absolutely certain of that. Okay, ladies, it's fairly different when it comes to a different country. So is the facial symmetry thing different for different countries? I don't think so. I think that's one of those universal consistencies, that it's a universal trait. Symmetry is considered attractive across all cultures. Okay, I'm going to stop here and give you your last polling question just so you have it. Okay, it's going to be very simple for you, and it's going to be about, crap, I didn't give you the stress smell one, right? Okay, here we go. Being presented as subliminal odor, oh boy, 1 minute. Okay, I'm gonna read it out loud just in case you don't take a picture. Being presented a subliminal odor from a person under stress could A, make you interpret neutral expression faces as more fearful, B, clean up cookie crumbs, C, make you plan to do more cleaning activities, like, you know, later on, or both B and C. It's a tiny bit tricky. Read through it and I will give you the answer. And I realize we're going a couple of seconds over, but hopefully it's worth it to you. Aha. I guess you can change your answer. So people are putting D and then they're realizing it's wrong. Okay, I'm going to stop it here. I understand only 60% of you have voted, but here we go. Just so you have this, the results are in and most people got it right. The answer is A. Now, it is the sort of question where I've had a lot of both A and B or all the above answers on these questions. Don't get distracted by that. Some of the times it's not going to be the right answer, right? The subliminal odor of a person under stress has nothing to do with cookies or has nothing to do with cleaning. cleaning cookies or other planned cleaning things for later on. It has to do with things that seem to make you experience things in a more fearful way, including neutral expressions. Okay, take a picture if you haven't, and I will see you on Tuesday. Again, hey, if you need to take class time to vote, go ahead. We'll certainly have this online, and good luck with your tests if you take it before I see you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.